A series of geopolitical risks, from the erratic trade war between the US and China and remaining ambiguity over Brexit, to tensions in the Middle East, Hong Kong, and now recently Chile, that have created an extraordinary situation that is not only very difficult to predict, but also bears the risk of volatility in the financial markets. And it's already obvious that these uncertainties are beginning to impact world economy. After a decade of global growth, there are clear signs of a slowdown. In some major economies, the warning bells of a recession are ringing, and that does include Europe.
Sounds like he's concerned, given that his bank is technically bankrupt. Don't ask me how I know, but Deutsche Bank filed for bankruptcy today. Tomorrow it will be all over the news, and our system will start to break under its own weight. Prophecy is circulating that Deutsche Bank has allegedly filed bankruptcy, saying it has not been confirmed yet, but Europe's biggest investment bank, Deutsche Bank, is in big trouble. If it becomes true, it will be the end of the financial system as we know it. Deutsche Bank could not fail without causing a domino effect and taking with it the whole system. It's also a harbinger of a bigger problem with European banks in general, which are loaded with trillions of euros in non-performing bank loans they haven't been able to shed since the crisis of 2008 and subsequent Eurozone double-dip recession of 2011. The region's banks and insurers have lost dramatic amounts of ground, with only one still ranking in the top 20 globally by market value, compared with 6 before the financial crisis. Deutsche Bank AG President Karl von Rohr said yesterday at Bloomberg LP's Future of Finance conference in Frankfurt, while challenges abound from an erratic trade war to Brexit to unrest in Hong Kong and Chile, they pale in comparison with the headwinds for banks from low and negative rates, he said. Jim Rogers gives his opinion on a subject as important as the Deutsche Bank fine and a possible bankruptcy of the German banking giant. If you look at its balance sheet, you will see it has huge, staggering debts, both on balance sheet and off balance sheet, which means they're debts that they don't reveal directly. It probably will survive if it has support, but otherwise we are all going to have huge problems in the next couple of years. We all should be very worried. The world is going to have a lot of problems the next couple of years. Politicians and bureaucrats have all the power. They take it and they run with it. Power corrupts. It has been happening for hundreds of years. And what happens if Deutsche Bank fails? What would that mean for the European Union and the financial world in general, Jim Rogers says. The EU would disintegrate because Germany would no longer be able to support it, would not want to support it. A lot of other people would start bailing out. Many banks in Europe have problems, and if Deutsche Bank has to fail, that is the end of it. In 1931, when one of the largest banks in Europe failed, it led to the Great Depression and eventually World War II. Be worried. Germany has been telling everybody not to bail out their banks, but if they have to suddenly bail out their banks, then other countries will be furious and the politicians will have a field day. The banking sector is having a rough time. According to a McKinsey report, 1 in 3 banks threaten to disappear in the coming months. Conscious of the stakes, the banks have already begun their process of rationalization, and the potion is bitter. In 10 years, 2008 to 2018, already 600,000 banking jobs have been lost in Eurozone. The first German bank, Deutsche Bank, has announced this summer that it will cut 18,000 jobs worldwide by 2022 as part of a $7.4 billion restructuring plan. According to McKinsey, banking institutions have no choice but to refocus their activity on certain trades, just like Deutsche Bank, which will close down almost all of its equity-related activities. Last week, as the Fed was carrying out hundreds of billions of dollars in emergency loan operations on Wall Street for the second week in a row, the first such operation since the financial crisis, Deutsche Bank's headquarters office in Frankfurt, Germany was being raided by police for the second time in less than a year. That's not the sort of thing that inspires confidence among depositors to keep their money in your bank. Deutsche Bank has been a constant headache for the U.S. financial system because it is heavily intertwined via derivatives with the big banks on Wall Street, including J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and Bank of America. It has become the dark cloud on the horizon in the same way Citigroup cast a negative pall in the early days of the financial crisis of 2008. It's not a good omen that Citigroup stock eventually went to 99 cents and the bank received the largest taxpayer and Federal Reserve bailout in U.S. history. The Fed alone secretly pumped $2.5 trillion in revolving loans into Citigroup from December 2007 to the middle of 2010. The latest raid at Deutsche Bank occurred on Tuesday and Wednesday of last week, September 24th and 25th, and was related to the $220 billion money laundering probe of Danske Bank, Denmark's largest lender. Deutsche Bank served as a correspondent bank to Danske's Estonia branch, where the laundering is alleged to have occurred. On Wednesday, as the raid was proceeding, the body of Ivar Rehe, who previously ran the Estonia business of Danske Bank, was discovered by police in Estonia. Rehe has been questioned by prosecutors and was considered a key witness in the probe. His death is being called an apparent suicide by European media. On the day the police raid started at Deutsche Bank, Tuesday, September 24th, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York offered $30 billion in 14-day emergency term loans and had demand for more than twice that amount. That led the New York Fed to increase its subsequent 14-day term loans from $30 billion to $60 billion later in the week. The Fed's overnight repo loans were offered every day last week, were also increased from $75 billion per day to $100 billion per day. Deutsche Bank has been in slow-motion collapse as a result of its serial crime charges, while international regulators have failed to address the fact that it's a counterparty to $49 trillion notional face value in derivatives, according to its 2018 annual report, and thus presents systemic risk throughout the global financial system. Its similarities to Citigroup in 2008 are mind-numbing, given a decade of political talk about how risk has been reined in on Wall Street. The Deutsche Bank social media team has caused a Twitter storm after moving to deny a story published by conspiracy blog Zero Hedge that it was on the verge of collapse. Likening Deutsche Bank's travails to that of Lehman Brothers before its collapse, the Zero Hedge take presented the giant German bank as a zombie institution on the brink of a catastrophic ruination that would bring down the entire financial system. All the more remarkable then to see Deutsche Bank's social media team deigning to issue a rebuttal which served only to add a sheen of legitimacy to the Zero Hedge line. Just like we witnessed with Lehman Brothers, there's always an effort to maintain the charade until the very last minute. This led to a collective outpouring from the libertarian Twitter fringe, typified by this post. Strange that a bank is out commenting on an article like this. German financial services giant Deutsche Bank AG is one of the largest and most important economic institutions in the world. Mainly due to self-imposed scandals, the bank is now having to take drastic measures to stay afloat. Investors everywhere should note that if such a critical piece of the too-big-to-fail banking system falters, it could trigger another global economic collapse and stock market crash. Is Deutsche Bank the next Lehman Brothers?
The financial and political opinions expressed in this video are not necessarily of Financial Argument or its staff. Opinions expressed in this video do not constitute personalized investment advice and should not be relied on for making investment decisions.
Tonight,
my pleasure.
Another economist considered one of the world's smartest guys is coming out with bad news. This guy's name is Nouriel Roubini. Nouriel Roubini. He's a Turkish immigrant who's considered one of America's foremost economic minds, who was the #2 man in the Department of Treasury under President Bill Clinton. He has just announced, a couple of hours ago, by the way, when this crossed, that according to him, the global recession is already underway. That's what he's saying. And he's warning central banks all over the world not to try and get out of it by simply printing more money as they have in the past. This is a sentiment echoed just yesterday by the aforementioned, in my conversation with Dr. Wolf, Ray Dalio, right? So here you have these two guys, prolific, famous, well-known, saying kind of the same thing. So what gives, right? Why are we suddenly hearing this from so many people? There's one guy, one person who's been making that argument now for years, and he's been called everything from a kook to a rabble-rouser for saying that very thing. Former Congressman Ron Paul has been screaming it from the mountaintop. The Fed and central bankers, he has long said, are the problem. Joining us now, there he is, none other than Dr. Ron Paul. This is interesting, isn't it, to hear a guy like Roubini essentially saying the things that you have been saying. If we keep printing more money, whatever recession comes will be worse. You agree, I imagine, right?
Yeah, certainly, but it seemed like they were still blaming too much capitalism, too much freedom, and it hasn't worked out, and we have to have something else. But I think this is all explainable. It was predictable by Austrian economists over the years that if you destroy the middle class, or if you destroy the currency, you destroy the middle class, and that's what's happened. We've accommodated many people who wanted help, a lot of welfareism, corporate as well as individual welfareism. We've done that at expense of running up debt. And when you do that, you have to borrow money, and the very people you're trying to help, the poor, they suffer. They end up getting the inflation. So this is a predictable event, and this pretense that debt has been okay because it's been helping people. All you have to look at the world today, $188 trillion of world debt, and that's supposed to help people, but it's not helping people because it's not the market, it's Keynesian economics, it's not sound money, it's not the gold standard. It's zero-rate interest rates, negative interest rates, and there's a dependency on government to solve all these problems when government has been at fault and have created these problems.
The Fed aside, let me take issue with you, Dr. Paul. Suppose you're right. Suppose the best thing we can do is allow people to start businesses and let the market rule. But what happens when those people become so big that they're able to essentially manifest the government, control the government, buy the politicians? Isn't that even worse?
Yeah, there's a problem with the politician who sells out. You don't have that. But you have to distinguish getting rich and powerful and influential from doing it by earning it and providing a service or a product for the people who voted them this economic authority. But if they don't, if they get their power because they're connected to the government, which is essentially all the powerhouses, the banking industry, the military-industrial complex, the social media has had advantages from the government. That's wrong, and you can't allow that to happen. But if you have a company that provides a service or a computer that everybody likes and they vote you rich and you haven't had any benefits from the government, you should applaud them. But nobody does. Anybody who's rich is bad, and that's what's going on right now because a lot of them got rich because they were in bed with the government. They're partners with the government. All you have to do is go around Washington, D.C. You ought to see where the big houses are. They're with the lobbyists. But if you had a limited government, there'd be no incentive to have lobbyists. When I was in Congress, the lobbyists never came to see me, because my vote wasn't for sale. And it's a system that is very bad. They've been rewarded. Businesses are rewarded, and they figure that's the only way they can go. And what we need is honesty in government. That is honest monies, balanced budget, follow the law, don't get in wars that aren't authorized. And all of a sudden, it would be a different world. But just because they're big and it looks like they're influencing the government, which is true, that's secondary. You're looking at the symptom. The real problem is the acceptance of the role of government to manage our lives, manage the economy, policing the world, and telling people what to do. That's where the problem is. You need a lot of bureaucrats to do that.
I need you, before you go, to at least address the central bank issue. Central banks all over the world right now are either printing money or dropping interest rates. It seems to me that that's a foolish errand. You say what?
Well, it's a terrible idea, but it's a logical consequence of steadily lowering interest rates and not to having the courage and wisdom of stopping that and let the market determine interest rates. So no, this is natural, because if you stop, there's a lot of painful suffering from that. There's an addiction out there, but the big problem is the debt. Nobody pays attention to that. So when people run into trouble, and all the countries are running into trouble, and then we run into spending more money and run up our debt and think we're going to solve the problem, and then print it to solve the problem. Won't work.
Unbelievable. Dr. Ron Paul, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you, sir, for coming on and sharing your perspective with us on this very important story that everybody suddenly seems to be talking about. My thanks.